Thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've known about Augustine since the early days. I think I interviewed David Lyle Jeffrey, who was one of the founders, about the time it was getting started. He was talking about alternative forms of higher education. And it resonated with me very much. The reason I went to seminary was I didn't want to become a pastor. I certainly didn't intend to go back into broadcasting, which is what I ended up doing. I wanted to work at an institution like this, providing basically a rich theological education that was committed to helping people understand the culture that they live in, not for professional clergy or church workers. And couldn't find that job when I finished my degree from seminary, and was offered a job back at National Public Radio, so I took that instead. Oliver O'Donovan, I'm going to try tonight to just give you a very whirlwind introduction to his work. And I'll say, by way of warning, that his work is difficult to read because every sentence and every word works hard. There's no slack in his writing. And there's no slack in his thinking either. I've interviewed him numerous times and had private conversations with him, and the intensity is matched only by his generosity and conviction. I was not, as a young man, that interested in politics. My interest in the arts, my interest in culture was principally in the arts. And I had a lot of friends growing up in the DC area in particular. Had a lot of friends very much involved in political issues, and I didn't pay that close attention to it. I eventually realized that the history of modern culture and the history of changes in the arts and that side of culture are very much intertwined with changes in politics. One quick way of recognizing that is how notions about freedom and authority, two concepts that O'Donovan deals with quite a bit, obviously shape politics, but they also shape understanding of personal creativity and imagination. So I got interested, and then as the political situation around us seemed to become more and more surreal, I spent quite a bit more time doing interviews and reading. And O'Donovan is one of the key people who I think has helped me understand political life and social order in light of the gospel almost more than anyone else, especially since the presidential election in 2016 in the US. The political climate has been unsettling as well as unsettled, and against the disturbing backdrop of what seemed to be increasing social and cultural fragmentation, pundits and commentators worked overtime to analyze the very surreal cultural and political scene. Unfortunately, I haven't seen a lot of discussion at all about whether the fractious and sometimes frightening state of political life, social life, is an indication of the falseness or inadequacy of some of our established assumptions about politics. In other words, is what we're living through a sign of the failure that our political structures haven't been well maintained, or is it the logical outcome of a system with critical design flaws? Does a more hopeful future require the radical revision of some basic beliefs about public life, about the relationship between state and society, about the purposes of government, about the relationship between freedom and authority, about how the ordering of temporal affairs accounts for the full reality of what we are as human persons? These and other relevant questions are finally theological questions, even if they're not acknowledged as such. Perhaps what we need is what a number of people have suggested is a better definition of the word politics. What does the word politics, what should the word politics refer to? Now it tends to refer, first of all, to the work of government and parties and elections and regulations. Oliver O'Donovan, I'll give a quick spoiler here from one of his most important books on this topic. In the middle of the book, he goes off on a little bit of a tangent and says, by what right is the term political claimed exclusively for the defense of social structures which refuse the deeper spiritual and cosmic aspirations of mankind? He's referring here to the fact that in modern Western democracies, what we could call substantive notions of the good, what is truly good, transcendently, are assumed to be out of bounds for political discussion. We're not going to bring that into public. It's fine in private if you have some notion of what is truly good and truly true. But when we come into political settings, we set that aside. He says the price. He says modern view of politics makes the polis constitutionally hostile to philosophy, theology, and artistic vision. It confines the social good to something that would satisfy an assembly of slave-holding landowners. A pure political theory, which can make it a matter of intellectual conscience to disinterest itself in the transcendent, is not one that any humane thinker need feel guilty about rejecting. If political order must be conceived in that way, it would be well, perhaps, that theology should be anti-political. But political order need not be conceived in that way. Our notions of the public and the political may be made wider and more generous, and in fact, historically, they were. That is what a political theology shaped by the Christ event must undertake. In the first place, it must criticize existing notions of political good and necessity, not only classical Republican notions, but imperial and theocratic notions too, in the light of what God has done for the human race and the human soul. Public norms must be adjusted to the new realities when ordinary members of society may hear the voice of God and speak it in public, even, according to the prophet, men and women and slaves. Ideas of what government is must be corrected in the light of that imperious government which the Spirit wields through the conscience of each worshiper. This is political theology in its liberal mode, attacking and overcoming the pretentiousness of the autonomous political order. But there's a constructive side to its task, which is to show how the extension of the gospel of the kingdom elevates rather than destroys our experience of community. Political theology has an ecclesiological role which takes the church seriously as a society and shows how the rule of God is realized there. Then independence of the individual believer is not antisocial. It arises from the authority of another community centered in the authority of the risen Christ. Okay, that's a lot to take in right away, but I wanted to get that out that before I start talking about his political theology, because I wanted to make it clear that when he talks about politics, he has a vision of the political, which is much different than what we particularly understand. Modern politics is typically characterized by the assumption that we must think about politics as if God didn't exist. Theology and politics are kept safe by a high wall of separation, to use an American phrase that we like, some of us. But that claim to say that theology and politics should be kept separate is already a theological claim. That's not a neutral claim. That has theological assumptions to it. And it's a contestable claim. A lot of public conversation that passes for neutral actually smuggles all sorts of theological assumptions into play. I spoke to the folks at Cardis today, and I said I think one of their tasks as a think tank is to expose the instances where people think they're speaking in a neutral way about public matters. Actually, often the claims that are being made smuggle all sorts of theological and philosophical assumptions into play. But I think, given the contentiousness of social life and political life, I think we're living in a moment where the pretense that life can be understood and organized perfectly well as if God didn't exist needs to be unmasked. And I think that the social and political disquiet sensed by many citizens won't be well understood or addressed without relying on theological sources. And Oliver O'Donovan has done more than anyone I know to underscore and expound, explore, develop those kinds of resources. In a 2005 book that he wrote called The Ways of Judgment, he explained political thought as a reflection on how, by whom, when, and in what order decisions are to be made by human beings on human action. It is a reflective train of thought, not oriented to the deliberative moment of practical reason, the point of decision, but to the social setting from within which that final point may be approached. If political thought is to be approached intelligently, then the institutions and practices that generated it must themselves be intelligible. They have to make sense. Deliberative political questions presuppose descriptions of political forms and realities, but these descriptions are not value-neutral systemic analyses. For without a knowledge of the good which political practices serve, analysis can give no account of the way in which they serve it. Political description is helpful only if it makes the institutions morally intelligible. Now, in 2016, the summer of 2016, I'd been corresponding with Dr. O'Donovan about some interviews, and that was about the time the Republican Party in the U.S. was ready to hold its convention, and there seemed what seemed to me to be unbelievable rumors that Donald Trump could be a candidate for president. And I have a great sense of the absurd and ironic, but this seemed to be kind of surpassing anything we expected. And I wrote to him and I said, I can't believe what we're going through here. And he wrote back, and I've quoted this, I didn't get his permission to quote it, but the astonishing political phenomenon in which your nation is currently caught up is part of an international wave of similar phenomena, though they take different forms in different places. The politicians identify the problem as a sense of discontent and political exclusion. Christians, perhaps, have learned enough to read the problem as that of a moral unintelligibility which has befallen the institutions of Western government, a state of things for which the churches too must bear their share of the blame. So he was saying that the absurd things that seem to be happening, or the seemingly absurd things that are happening, might be a better way of putting it, is the result of the fact that the institutions that we have are no longer understood. The reason for them, their rootedness is no longer understood. And he argued in that book, The Ways of Judgment, that I mentioned earlier, that Christian theology actually has ways of explaining how political institutions, and particularly the idea of political authority, and the making of demands on a populace, why that can be made morally intelligible. He wrote, and this is 20 years ago, the intelligibility of political institutions and traditions is seriously threatened. And Christian theology sheds light on institutions and traditions to address a crisis that is more pressing on unbelievers than on believers. I thought this was very interesting. That unbelievers have less of a reason to believe in the possible authoritative voice of government than believers do. That they are living in a more nihilistic setting than believers are. He said, actually, I'm going to skip that. He said, Western civilization finds itself the heir of political institutions and traditions which it values without any clear idea why or to what extent it values them. Faced with decisions about their future development, it has no way of telling what counts as improvement and what as subversion. It cannot tell where straight ahead lies, let alone whether it ought to keep going there. And then he says that his own work is not to defend a particular form of government, but the coherence of political conceptions as such. He's taking the idea of nationhood, or the idea of, again, of political authority, of rule, and trying to make them, in some way, properly intelligible. I think that's a word that comes back to mind often. So who is Oliver O'Donnell? Who's this guy saying this? He was born in 1945, educated at Oxford and briefly at Princeton University, where he studied with renowned ethicist Paul Ramsey, who was best known for his work in bioethics and in just war theory. His first formal teaching position was at Wycliffe Hall in Toronto, where he taught in the late 70s and early 80s, and had the good fortune of meeting his wife, Joan Lockwood, who is also a renowned Anglican theologian. And then from 1982 until 2006, he held the prestigious post of Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology and Canon of Christ Church at the University of Oxford, which is pretty amazing tenure. And then from 2006 to 2012, he was Professor of Christian Ethics and Practical Theology at the School of Divinity in New College, Edinburgh. He's best known among his peers, his colleagues, and it's unfortunate that his insights haven't trickled down a lot. I know he turned 80 this year. He's thinking a lot about what his legacy will be. He had a number of students, but how is that work going to be trickling down? There's talk of Mars Hilario helping to foster some of that by collecting a lot of his material, including a number of unpublished sermons that he's given over the years, which I'm dying to see. A friend of mine is getting access to them. One theologian who expressed appreciation for him described his career this way. He said, "Perhaps no other of his contemporaries has managed to combine so effectively a deep familiarity of and love of Scripture, an extraordinary knowledge of the magisterial tradition of doctrinal and moral theology, and a commitment to the illumination of both the concepts and applications of Christian ethics." In 2005, he was interviewed by Rupert Short, a British journalist/theologian, a book called God's Advocates, Christian Thinkers in Conversation. And the interview began with a question about the overall pattern of O'Donovan's work. And I found this very interesting to read, given having read a lot of his books. If there's any program of recovery in my work, it's the recovery of practical reasoning, which has been lost in theology and also in philosophy and the social sciences. My teacher, Paul Ramsey, subtitled one of his books, "How Shall Modern War Be Conducted Justly?" stressing the word shall, not as a future of prediction, but of deliberation. How are we to think about how to act? And how are we to think especially about how to act in political contexts in our human solidarities? How are we to think of ourselves as citizens? But what is a citizen? Of nation states. But what is a nation state? Where are we to find an intelligible account of the non-self-interpreting forms and structures through which we have to pick our way? I'm a political theologian because as a thinker I can only address these questions with reference to the illuminating power of the Christian faith. I am a political theologian because as a believer I need to be able to put one foot after the next. His concern for exploring how we should think about, before we ask what we should think, is expressed in a trilogy of books that he published most recently. I guess they're his most recent books, save one, between 2013 and 2017, a series called Ethics as Theology. The first book was called Self, World, and Time, and Self, World, and Time refers to the fact that that we need to understand who we are, where we are, and when we are. when we're making ethical decisions. So to understand the nature of our own subjectivity, what kind of vocation, what kind of gifts do we have, and I'm oversimplifying it here. And then what are the things in the world? What is the nature of the things that we actually encounter? And then when are we? He's very eager in several places to challenge forms of zealotry or idealism. He says it's easy to say that what we can do isn't necessarily what we should do, but it's also important to recognize that what we should do doesn't mean we should do it right now. That also, and time is a very significant, where we are in time is a very significant piece of his thinking. In that self-world and time, he writes, ethics is necessarily an architectural enterprise, bringing trains of thought together which have different inner logics. The practitioner must be able to function polymorphously, there's a great word, with kind of in different forms. Now telling a narrative, now mounting an argument that proceeds to inference, now depicting reality adequately from many sides. There's always a temptation to play ethics as rugby is played, eyeing up the shortest route, putting the head down, and shoving as hard as possible. He wants to approach ethics architecturally rather than in a rugby-esque manner. The second volume in that book was called Finding and Seeking, and the third volume was called Entering into Rest, and I'm hoping to read a short excerpt from that at the end of my talk tonight. The themes in those books about, and again, ethics as theology, that when we're doing this kind of ethical reflection, it's always informed by theological assumptions and by the theological narratives of Scripture, and particularly the history of Israel and the history of the church, but also biblical teaching. Those themes were taken up in his most recent work. He gave the Gifford Lectures at St. Andrews in 2021, and they were published as The Disappearance of Ethics. Other books I will mention briefly, and then we're going to look at two in particular. A book called Begotten or Made, published in 1984. Begotten or Made, which actually was addressing the question of the ethical questions raised by in vitro fertilization, which at the time were controversial. They've lost their controversial status, but the questions he raises there are still relevant, even though nobody thinks it's a contestable issue. And that's something Paul Ramsey actually testified on Capitol Hill in D.C. When those birth technologies were being considered for regulation. In the title, Begotten or Made, obviously an allusion to the Nicene Creed, but he basically asks, do we beget our children or do we make our children? And what difference would it make, given the difference in thrust in those two verbs? Resurrection and Moral Order was a 1986 central work in ethics, and I'm going to spend a little time on that in a minute. And then The Desire of the Nations, Rediscovering the Roots of Political Theology. He gave, I think in 2001, gave lectures at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, 3 lectures that were published under the title Common Objects of Love, subtitled Moral Reflection and the Shaping of Community. And I often say this is the easiest Oliver O'Donovan book to read. So if you're interested in reading something, probably don't start with the books that I'll talk about tonight because they're very demanding. Common Objects of Love, I think, is much more approachable and actually has political consequences. What does it mean to be a people? He and his wife, Joan, co-wrote a collection of essays called Bonds of Imperfection. And then they also edited a huge anthology of readings from Christian political thought from about the year 100 to 1625. It's called From Irenaeus to Grotius, a source book of Christian political thought. It's just an amazing collection of readings, which present ideas that have largely been forgotten by well-educated Christians who speak about politics. O'Donovan said in that interview with Rupert Short, those who listen sensitively to the past understand their own present better. But my sense is that very few people with the theological acumen to do this haven't done that kind of reading. And he starts off the book that, I'll come to the Desire of Nations in a minute and talk about his lamenting the absence of understanding with the tradition. But I think before we get to that, I think it would be good to talk about his book, Resurrection and Moral Order, which was subtitled An Outline for Evangelical Ethics. And by evangelical, he's not identifying with a particular stream of Protestantism. By evangelical, he means informed by the gospel, informed by the euangelion. And the book is written in 3 parts. He deals with the objective reality, that is the order of creation that we're dealing with when we make ethical decisions. Then there's the subjective reality, which is the human person and conscience and all of those issues. And then part 3 is the form of the moral life. Now, since we're in Eastertide, and East and West, which is remarkable. My daughter is in an Orthodox church, and this is the first time we've celebrated Easter and Pascha simultaneously. It's really good to think about the resurrection, and you could summarize resurrection and moral order as O'Donovan's answering the question, what makes Christian ethics Christian? What makes it different from other forms of ethics? And he argues, in a nutshell, the resurrection. It's the fact of the resurrection. Not the idea of the resurrection, the fact of the resurrection. On the early pages, there's a passage I want to read a stirring passage that I often cite. He says, because it is a reversal of Adam's decision to die. Notice how he's describing the fall. Adam's decision to die. Because it is a reversal of Adam's decision to die, the resurrection of Christ is a new affirmation of God's first decision that Adam should live. An affirmation that goes beyond and transforms the initial gift of life. The first man, and here he's quoting from 1 Corinthians 15, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. So the work of the Creator who made Adam, who brought into being an order of things, and I'm going to underscore that phrase because that phrase, the idea that creation is an order of things, is throughout his work. The work of the Creator who made Adam, who brought into being an order of things in which humanity has a place, is affirmed once and for all by this conclusion. That is the conclusion that Christ is raised from the dead. It might have been possible, before Christ rose from the dead, for someone to wonder whether creation was a lost cause. If the creature consistently acted to uncreate itself, now again, how he's describing sinfulness, not just in terms of disobedience, but as the opposite of creation. If the creature consistently acted to uncreate itself and with itself to uncreate the rest of creation, which is groaning, as Paul tells us in Romans, did this not mean that God's handiwork was flawed beyond hope of repair? It might have been possible before Christ rose from the dead to answer in good faith, yes. Before God raised Jesus from the dead, the hope that we call Gnostic, the hope for redemption from creation rather than the redemption of creation, might have appeared to be the only possible hope. But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, 1 Corinthians 15:20. That fact rules out those other possibilities. For in the second Adam, the first is rescued. The deviance of Adam's will, its fateful leaning toward death, has not been allowed to uncreate what God created. Man's life on earth is important to God. He has given it its order. It matters that it should conform to the order he has given it. And again, he's saying the resurrection confirms the goodness and ultimate inviolability of that order. The fall doesn't mean that the order that's present in creation, which God says is very good, that it's somehow undone, even though we act as if it was undone. The resurrection confirms the goodness of that order. And he says, once we've grasped that, we can understand how this order requires of us both a denial of all that threatens to become disordered and a progress towards a life which goes beyond this order without negating it. Now, one of the consequences of this will be very controversial, and here he's kind of verging on the political here, because in the political realm and in modern democracies, we appreciate diversity and pluralism and equality. Early in Resurrection of Moral Order, he says, since creation and human nature with it are reaffirmed in the resurrection, we must firmly reject the idea that Christian ethics is esoteric, that it's opted into by those who so choose and irrelevant to those who do not so choose. Christian ethics, that's fine for you Christians, just don't bother the rest of us with it. It's easy to see how this misconception has gained favor. Western moral thought since the Enlightenment has predominantly understood morality as the creation of man's will. Morality is just what is willed. It's the way in which we impose order on this life, not the way in which we discern the order that's present in life, both individually and socially. Moral reasoning is subservient to the commitment of the will. For Christians who accept this account of moral thought, and he says a lot of theologians have accepted this, he says then Christian moral duties are just kind of like ecclesiastical house rules, like respect for the clergy or giving to the church. Duties which presuppose membership of the church community and lay no claim on those outside it. Even the prohibitions of adultery and murder are, apparently, house rules of this type. The failure of the non-believer to respect his marriage or his neighbor's life is nothing extraordinary, since, lacking the faith commitment of a Christian, he does not have any reason to respect his marriage or his neighbor's life. This view is evidently mistaken, he says, if for no other reason because so many unbelievers do respect their marriages and their neighbors' lives. But more significantly, so many non-Christian cultures require that they should do so. So in other words, the order that's present in creation against adultery and murder is perceived within non-Christian settings as well. The theological weakness which has led to this mistaken understanding is ultimately, he describes, as a failure to reckon with creation, and so with the reality of a divinely given order of things in which human nature itself is located. The order of things that God has made is there. It is objective, and mankind has a place in it. Christian ethics, therefore, has an objective reference because it's concerned with man's life in accordance with this order. The summons to live in that order is addressed to all mankind because the good news that we may live in it is addressed to all mankind. Thus, Christian moral judgments in principle address every man. They're not something which the Christian has opted into and which he might as well, quite as sensibly, have opted out of. They're founded on reality as God has given it. In this assertion, we can find a point of agreement with the classical ethics of Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, which treated ethics as a close correlate of metaphysics. And I would say in the Eastern tradition, in Confucius, you find similar ideas. The way the universe is determines how man ought to behave himself in it. That should be a self-evident thing, but in debates about ethical matters that happen in public, honestly, I rarely hear even Christians make that point. And it's not even an exclusively Christian point. It's reinforced by the fact of the resurrection, I think, by the fact that Jesus Christ is still a human being and still has, in a sense, a created nature tied to his uncreated nature. But I think we're afraid of saying those things in public because maybe we're not certain that it is the case. I want to leave resurrection and moral order and move on to the explicitly political work, and that's the desire of the nations, which Ross was pointing out. There's a blurb on the back here, published in when the book first came out. O'Donovan's masterful work should be read by everyone interested in the daunting complexities of the political theology of Israel, Christendom, and now post-Christendom. I wouldn't recommend it to everyone. It's very demanding. It took me a long time to get through it, and I've gone back over it. So I want to try to summarize some of the key ideas here. In fact, let me read from a summary that someone else has written that I think is a wonderful one-paragraph summary. Here's the summary. The Old Testament establishes that the Lord is king. Psalm 93. I can actually hear an anthem written, "The Lord is king, put on glorious apparel." But that's throughout the Old Testament. And the fact that the Lord is king, he rules over both Israel and the nations of the world. Although a duality between the claims of political authority and the claims of God has been inserted into human political experience, a duality that was first evident in the exile in Babylon, Jesus Christ proclaims anew that unitary kingship. The Lord is king over everything. He affirms that unitary kingship in his preaching of the kingdom of God. And by the way, kingdom, just if you haven't been told of this, the word we translate kingdom, in Greek, basileia, really means kingship more than, it's rule rather than realm. It's not a place. It's more, so kingdom can mean kingship. It's the rule of God, the reign of God, not the realm of God. Jesus Christ proclaims anew that unitary kingship in his preaching of the kingdom of God and decisively establishes it in his death and triumphant resurrection. While the claiming of the great city as the holy city promised in the book of Revelation has yet to be manifested in this time between the times, the political structures of the old age are given license to continue their rule. So even though Jesus is on the throne ruling everything, there's still earthly rulers who continue their rule, but only within the eschatological context of Christ's reign. The church, therefore, also finds itself as a political authority ruled by another king with a Christological and eschatological orientation that can never allow it to become merely a provider of spiritual services to an autonomous political realm. Stanley Hauerwas, who disagrees with O'Donovan on many things, but he often talks about the church, particularly the Protestants in America, as providing chaplaincy services for the American project. That's not what we're there for. We're not there to provide encouragement for a project that is, as this author summarized, autonomous, independent of Christ, independent of God, independent of the order of creation. Secular political authority now finds itself divested of any ultimate claim on its subject's identity. In other words, political leaders aren't the last word. They're under Christ's authority, whether they know it or recognize it or not, or whether we recognize it or not, whether any of the voters who voted for them or the people who funded their campaigns recognize it or not. Rulers are to renounce their sovereignty, so O'Donovan insists, a truth that they came to realize in the period known as Christendom. He talks a lot about Christendom in here, and some people have said he's trying to reestablish what Christendom looked like before the rise of modern politics. He's not doing that. O'Donovan interprets Christendom not as a bid for secular power by the church, but as secular powers recognizing the command of Christ represented in the church. Political acts are finally authorized as analogies of divinely authorized acts, something increasingly forgotten in the liberal social orders which have succeeded Christendom and which assume that political order is ultimately founded in human corporate will. the will of the consent of the governed, the will of the governed. That's where political authority lies. But O'Donovan insists that that's not a picture of political authority that is either present in the scriptures or was present in about 1,600 years of Christian reflection on what the teaching of the scriptures was, and it doesn't conform to the fact of the ascension. He's seated at, I often say, when we say Christ is seated at the right hand of God, he's not in a barca lounger to relax. He's on a throne, and he's ruling. That's why he's there. Now, in the introduction to The Desire of the Nations, which is called Rediscovering the Roots of Political Theology, O'Donovan laments the fact that contemporary political theology is, he says that the relation of contemporary political theology to the long tradition can be summed up in a single bleak word: ignorance. For the most part, the tradition, with its wealth of suggestive theopolitical debate and analysis, has been occluded by the shadow of the modern period. Why has the shadow been so dark and the eclipse so total? To understand the task faced by political theology, we need to make contact with the tradition again, but we need something further. We need to understand the causes of the eclipse. Why have we forgotten this tradition? Why have even Christian theologians and Christian statesmen, why are they willfully ignorant of this incredible tradition? He says in part it's, well, I won't go into why he says that. It takes too much time. But in summarizing the tradition, he writes in the introduction to from Irenaeus to Grotius, this big reader. He says, for a millennium and a half, from the patristic age to the early modern period, the themes of creation, fall, Christology, the church, and eschatology, and the appeal to a wide range of Old and New Testament texts dominated the way political discussion was conducted. That's how you talked about politics, in light of all of that body of knowledge. And in an essay in that anthology, he says, he laments the fact that in the early modern era, there emerged from the tradition a new and distinctive approach to political thought, effectively independent of theological premises. And he names Hobbes as the first thinker who is gleefully independent of the tradition. And not that everyone was at the time. Now, why is the task of political theology a valid task, and how will we characterize it? He says political theology postulates an analogy, not just a metaphor or a poetic image, but an analogy grounded in reality between the acts of God, who rules all things, who is king, and human acts, both of them taking place within the one public history and mankind's social undertakings. The kingdom of God is not a mere kingdom, but it is a real kingdom. Now that's an elusive and suggestive phrase that haunted me for a long time. It was underlined, I think, with 2 lines in my book. And so when I got a chance to interview him, I got a chance to interview him publicly on Capitol Hill in Washington back in, I think it was 2013. It was one of those moments when Congress couldn't decide on a budget, so the government was shut down. And ironically, with poetic justice, here's Oliver O'Donovan to give a seminar on Capitol Hill in one of the office buildings about the nature of government, the meaning of government, when there was no government in sight. There was something fitting about that. But I asked him, what do you mean by saying the kingdom of God is not a mere kingdom, but it is a real kingdom? And here's what he said. I've transcribed these. He says, speaking of God, we inevitably use a range of pictures. It's easy for us to speak of God as Father. What we mean is that he's like a father. What we mean is that he's like a father in certain ways, perhaps, and then not perhaps like a father in other ways. And then perhaps that God is something unspeakable of which certain clues may be given to us in the language of fatherhood. We need to know how this image works. And of God as king, and as God as Father, so of God as King. I want to say what Paul says about fatherhood, from whom all fatherhood in heaven and earth are named. That is to say, don't think of your Father as the original and God as some sort of vague resemblance to that. Think of it the other way around. Think of the reality as being there in this extraordinary relationship we have to our Creator, who has loved and given us into being, and then see pale reflections of that in your parenting and your child relationship. So our fathers are a little bit like God, but God is the Father. Now it's the same with kingdom. It's easy for us, as it were, to step inch by inch back from the political content of this and say, well, of course, I disapprove of government, so God can't be like government in any sort of significant way. I mean, he's a bit like government, yes, in that I don't understand what he does, and sometimes he doesn't seem to be there. Now, I think we're warned. This is a dangerous train of thought. We're not invited to evacuate the metaphor. Rather, we should say the governments we know are pale reflections in the order of creation of what God does for the world and what God is for the world. Very inadequate reflections. But not because they're too much government, but because they're very much too little government as God understands government. So we've got to start our political thinking from there, from what we're shown, the government we're shown in God, the government of the world by God. Then he sighed. He said, this is a fearfully unfashionable thing to do. As I utter this thought, I realize how I was flying in the face of everything modern when I said that, and yet I'll repeat it here. Now that's very illuminating, and I think that when he talks about the fact that government and government institutions have become morally unintelligible, I would argue that the intelligibility of political authority only makes sense in light of the transcendent reality of which they are analogs. Political authority is an analog of God's kingship. And if we deny God's kingship, or we believe God's kingship is just some kind of spiritual story that is comforting in some way, but not real, then eventually, over time, the very idea of political authority becomes less and less plausible. Now we can say, well, it's a result of the will of the majority. But at some deep level, I think that's ultimately satisfying, especially if you're not in the majority. I'll say a couple quick things. That in essence is the main theme, actually, of this very dense book, which has so many sparks that fly off of it, The Desire of the Nations. The second chapter in the book is how Israel begins to recognize God's kingship, Yahweh's kingship, I should say, Yahweh's authority. And he describes the pattern of Yahweh's authority, and you see this all throughout the Old Testament, profoundly in the Psalms. He says Yahweh's authority as king is established by three things: the accomplishment of victorious deliverance. It's Yahweh who's delivered his people. By the presence of judicial discrimination, who, that is through the institution of judges, has provided guidance for how the people are to live. And through revelation, obviously, the giving of the law, and then the effort to apply the law. So you could summarize that by the presence of judicial discrimination. And by the continuity of community possession. And by that I think he means the continuity of the life of the community, of the life of the people of Israel. It's God who keeps them together. And he basically develops a very interesting theory of the essence of governmental authority tied to those three things, tied to, to summarize it even more, salvation, judgment, and possession. Salvation, judgment, and possession. And then he adds to that the response of the people to those three things, the fact that Yahweh has delivered them, Yahweh has been guiding us through the law and the prophets and the judges and kings, more or less. And also God has kept us continuous. He adds to that the acknowledgement of the praise of Yahweh. So those are the four aspects that dominate it. Now, and he deals a lot with the nature of, he sees government more as not the pursuit of justice, but the making of judgments. And it's quite profound. He talks about how that the idea of judgment in the Scripture is he says it's an event, it's a performance. The judgments of Yahweh have a lasting validity because all of Yahweh's acts have a lasting validity. And that's why the emphasis on wisdom in the Old Testament is so important, because it's the making of just judgments about what God has revealed and what creation is that are the legitimate source of political authority. Now, quickly jump to the New Testament. Actually, more of this book is on the New Testament. The Ascension, which I have to confess, as a kid who grew up in the Presbyterian world, we didn't celebrate the Ascension. After Easter, it was all over, and now we're back to normal life. The Ascension is this amazing moment. He says it's the conclusion of the story of Christ. As its conclusion, it expresses the meaning of the story in a climactic way. The story has told of an act of divine rule, power put forth, judgment effected, and the gift of communal identity secured. The coronation of Christ expresses the accomplishment of that act as a whole. I don't know how often we think of the Ascension as Christ's coronation, but it's a lot of the hymnody that's sung, a lot of the hymns that are sung around the time of the Ascension. The Ascension is the foundation which determines all future time. It determines the public existence of the church, which participates in the coming of the kingdom and witnesses to it, and through the church it determines the provisional public life of the world. Now, I'm going to close and with one quick amendment to that, and he says the description of secular authority in the New Testament. That is, why do we have secular leaders? And by secular, again, it means temporal, not religious. The word secular, secula, means ages. So he will often refer to Christian secular rulers. There's no contradiction in that. The word secular has come to mean nothing to do with God, nothing to do with religion. That's not what the word meant. The description of secular authority in the New Testament follows from the understanding of the authority of the risen Christ, which is present in the church's mission. So secular authorities, temporal authorities, are in a sense reauthorized. And he looks at two passages, 1 Timothy 2:1, which I'd never seen by anyone else developing a theory of politics, a theory of government from that pastoral epistle. I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings and all are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. This is good, and it is pleasing in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. For there is one God, and there is one mediator between God and men. That is, between everybody, the man Christ Jesus. And he goes on, as Paul is wont to do, going on for a long sentence. What O'Donovan develops from this is the idea that the principal vocation of secular governments from the time of the Ascension until Christ returns, their principal obligation is to make room for the church. Make room for the church to do its task. Now again, he's saying this in the middle of the Roman Empire, which was hardly celebrating Christian nationalism. But basically, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. Now some people wondered if Paul's a bit too pietistic and, just too passive there. But that is, that the task of the church is not, we know, in fact, that the Christians in the first century weren't just sitting around, having socials. They were proclaiming the gospel. And if the gospel is to be proclaimed to the whole world who benefit from the reality of God as Savior, the one God and one mediator between God and men, then the task of the church is ultimately a missionary task. And the task of governments, of secular rulers, as O'Donovan describes it, is a task to make room for the church. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. I ended up having about 10 times as much material as I could use, and knew this afternoon I went through and whittled a lot of it away, but obviously didn't whittle enough away. But I think that gives you a good enough introduction to O'Donovan's work, and you could urge your clergy to read him. And I'm convinced that I said to the Cardis people today that I think that the great task, O'Donovan's hardly alone in promoting a better understanding of politics theologically. But unfortunately, most of the insights for the last 40 years, many of which he's encouraged, have not trickled down to the congregations of people who vote and people who have strong political opinions that probably haven't been informed by a rich, adequate theological understanding. Before I quit, one quick a gift that I'll give you. I've done numerous interviews with O'Donovan. We've also obtained recordings of a number of lectures he's given. And on the Marshill Audio website, all that material is available if you're a paying member. But for this month only, there are no free steak knives included in this offer, but we've made all of them available to anyone. You just have to go to our page where there's free audio, sign up for what's called a visitor's pass. We don't do anything with your email address, send it to anybody else. But you can listen to all of the content that I've publicized about O'Donovan with him, including that long interview I did with him on Capitol Hill. MHA-members.org is the site. And if you type MHA-members.org/free, that will take you to a page with lots of free content. It's probably 30 or 40 hours of other material, as well as all of the Oliver O'Donovan material we have. And I think that will be, it's there for a month, so don't be tardy. Okay, thank you very much.
Clearly, Augustine College needs to have a chair, an O'Donovan chair of political philosophy. I'd like to open the floor for questions. What I generally do is try and summarize in a few sentences talks that I happen to be responsible for, but I'm generally doing this in a scientific sense, so I'm way out of my sphere here, but I'm going to try anyways. So, the too long didn't read, didn't listen closely. A summary is, behold, I make all things new. And Christ's command to his people is to go out and make disciples. The church is supposed to go out into the world to renew all of creation, and this is everything. And politics is throughout all of creation, and we are supposed to build this up. So, Christian, shoemaker to your last, grab your tools, build. Just as Adam was told, go out into the garden, the task starts anew. And so I open the floor for questions. Please.
I'd be curious about your thoughts and O'Donovan's thoughts when the governments you're living under are explicitly hostile to religious respecting the laicity of the state.
Yeah.
And the most contentious issues we see from the CBC is how it affects Sikhs and Muslims, teachers, government officials,
Yeah.
in their official positions can't wear their hijabs
Right.
or turbans. It's less clear about Christian symbolism.
Right.
But just generally, like when you live under a government that's actively hostile
Right.
to professions of faith.
So I'm trying to think of, well, I'll say first of all that early in his writings, he wrote an article about the lessons from the book of Revelation about politics. And he later wrote a more learned essay. It's in that book, Bonds of Imperfection, that I mentioned. It's in that collection. And I had taken a bunch of notes from that and then realized there's no way I'm going to get to that too. So he basically says that that governments can play on the Antichrist team, and we shouldn't be surprised when that happens. That eschatologically, that combat is guaranteed, and martyrdom is guaranteed, actually, as a result of that. So the question about what to do about it, I mean, I guess he would say, first of all, what to do about it is don't be surprised. But also, it's interesting that you commented that the public perception is how this is going to harm Sikhs and Muslims. I remember, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or so, there was a survey in the US of Muslims and asked, which is more important to you, being a Muslim or being American? And a lot of them said being a Muslim, which really angered a lot of American Christians who basically thought, well, most important thing to me is I'm American, not that I'm a Christian. And so the idea that their commitment to Christ was in some way secondary to the commitment to the Constitution was rather disturbing. Somehow we have not communicated to the good people of the CBC or NPR what our primary citizenship, where our primary citizenship is, and that has consequences, whether or not they like the consequences. Now, I think that what the state that we're in now, this advanced state, often of being post-Christian, O'Donovan, one of the themes in his work is we always have to recognize that where we are, when we are, is still not, it's not as if God has lost control. That his rule, God's ways are mysterious. I often think that the persecution that Christians in Western countries endure now is, in a way, a kind of, I don't know if I'd say judgment, but poetic justice for the way we've neglected bearing witness to what government should be. Witness that was consistent for 1,600 years. Not because the people bearing that witness were more pious or more dedicated or devoted than we are, but because they really did believe that God is king, and believe that it was unimaginable to order public life as it was unimaginable to order personal life, by denying the order of creation, and first of all, the order of creation, and secondly, the rule of Christ. So maybe the thing we need to do is have much bigger Ascension celebrations. People are worried about the war on Christmas. What about the war on the Ascension? That's where the big problem is. So I think that unless we've been consistent in bearing public witness to where government authority comes from, there's one other danger, I think, and that is for the churches for Christians to present themselves as another interest group. And that's a big mistake, I think, because then we're just reinforcing the idea that government is just about human will and power. So, and I see this in the U.S. a lot, that we're just going to be the biggest, meanest interest group and get power that way. That, in a sense, is a denial. That's as much a denial of Christ's kingship, because then it just says that we're all just players in something that involves the use of power only.
I'm John. Thank you very much for this. I was introduced to Augustine through a professor in my studies.
Yeah.
And you talked a couple times about the trickle down that's missing.
Yeah.
And I'd like to ask you how to address it. I see three challenges to it. One is I've assigned Augustine to undergrad students. I made that mistake.
That's a lot of
They hated it, and I was like, well, that was the point, was getting it out. The other two pieces are in conversations with Christian theologians who dismiss it because it's political theology and not kind of theology proper.
Right.
So that's one major group. So it's, how do we encourage a trickle down of a really important thinker where he's resisted there? And the second area of resistance is in a culture soaked in the language of human rights.
Right.
That Donovan is a strong critic of. Right. Not because he's against justice, but because he's, really concerned with the will. So how would you encourage a trickle down with?
Yeah. Well, on that last point, and I should say that Joan O'Donovan has probably done more writing on the question of rights than her husband has. And there have been, I interviewed Nigel Bigger, who took Oliver O'Donovan's position at Oxford when he left. He wrote a book called, I think it's What's Wrong with Rights, or something like that, and really analyzed very deeply the modern concept of rights. There's the problem with discussing any of these things is people aren't patient enough with the rationality of it. So you have to figure out, well, if you say, I remember having a conversation with a colleague at NPR years ago about some contested issue, and I kind of laid out the steps to get to a position. And I remember saying, well, I can see the logic of it, but I just don't like where it ends. And because I don't like where it ends, I'm going to dismiss the logic of it. So I guess part of the hygiene of this, or part of the discipline of it, is to restore, as O'Donovan, his big project is to restore the practice of practical reason. And so if people realize that ethical decisions have to be reasonable and not just expressions of our desires in some way. So that's the first thing. The theologians who disagree, I wanted to mention, this came out about 10 years ago. It's called The Authority of the Gospel, Explorations in Moral and Political Theology in honor of Oliver O'Donovan. And it's got some pretty big name people who do disagree with him on some points. I don't think most of them would disagree with him in big ways on a lot of his political theology. I'm curious, on what issue in particular is the disagreement that you're aware of? Was it on particular?
I mean, you didn't get that far enough in the conversation.
Yeah, well,
some colleagues
yeah,
who just kind of will know we're doing theology, proper political theology.
Yeah.
I have no interest in it.
Well, again, political again, I'd say, the first 10 pages of The Desire of the Nations, why is there still suspicion about political theology? When he started working, there was much more suspicion than there is now. And the great wall of separation between politics and theology was much firmer. in a sense, the Berlin Wall has fallen, but a lot of people didn't get the memo or something, because there's really a lot of really interesting work being done in political theology, and has been, and I think productive, fruitful, and not all from the same position. I mentioned, I think I mentioned the work of Stanley Hauerwas, for instance, who's working from a more Anabaptist. And on a more popular level, I don't know if you know the work of Peter Leithart. Peter comes from a Presbyterian background, studied with John Milbank, another important voice, and harder to read than O'Donovan, I think, in a lot of ways. And I haven't bothered to interview him many times. I've talked to him a couple times. But he's encouraged some important work. But back to Peter Leithart, a book called Against Christianity, which a very kind of pugnacious book that reinforces the idea of the church as a political community. And again, he quotes O'Donovan in a couple places, but he's not coming from a strictly O'Donovanian position, but he does believe that the redemptive historical trajectory that O'Donovan is basing his work on has consequences. The ascension has consequences for how we think about political order. One of my favorite lines from Peter's book is, "The church is not a club for religious people. The church is the form the new humanity takes as it's being perfected." I'm paraphrasing here. So we're in the already and not yet. The church is, and that idea, the church is not a club for religious people. It's I often see churches that behave as if they're just clubs for religious people, because when people go through the narthex and out into the world, they're not given a lot of instruction about what difference these things should make in the world.
One more question perhaps, and then we can continue discussions.
I'll stick around. I'm going to
Yeah. Thank you for your talk. I have a question about, does Oliver O'Donovan have a view of what it means to be a citizen? Is this a valid concept? What does he mean? Because from what you were saying, I was trying to gather, it sounds like there's a role in reminding the government of its the higher authority, but then we also don't want to be an interest group. But obviously if we say, well, remember government, the highest authority is Christ, not everyone agrees, so we can't get that legitimacy, and we kind of come out as an interest group. You also mentioned telling or calling people a practical reason, or being reasonable. Now, Aristotle, I'm guessing he's drawing from Aristotle there. He's asserted teleology, because if you just say, be reasonable today, it kind of risks that empty modernity you were critiquing before. So I'm just trying to understand what is the role of a citizen in Oliver O'Donovan's view, and how can that apply to today?
I can't think of a passage right off where he does do that. I mean, he does. He talks in Common Objects of Love. He talks more about members of political communities, which I guess could be citizen, but he thinks about it not as someone for whom someone to whom governments need to be responsible. He doesn't think of citizen that way. He thinks of it more in terms of a member of a political community, and then what defines a political community. Part of the problem we have now is he takes that phrase "common objects of love" from Aristotle, from Augustine, that a people is known by having common objects of love. The problem that we have now is that most political communities don't have that much in common in terms of their ultimate commitments, except to the commitment that they not be told what they need to be committed to, a commitment to a kind of negative freedom. But I think, back to your question about addressing governors, I think he'd see that less the role of citizens or even think tanks and more the role of the church. And part of the problem that we have here in North America, worse, I think, in the States, possibly, I don't know. The fact that the church is so fractured, I often think that bad governments get a lot of their power from the fact that the church is so broken up. And that's a point in Peter Leithart's work also, that to work for the unity of the church so that the church has something to say to government. The problem now is churches might say something to government, but they don't agree. But I think he would rather have churches speak, but not so much on particular policies. I think to underscore the principles on which policies are made and to make sure those principles are heard. I think now I know Nigel Bigger in his essay in here, he takes issue with O'Donovan on this question of whether or not individual theologians should speak out as citizens. Oliver is much more reticent to speak on specific policy issues, although that book, Begotten or Made, was very clear what he thought of in vitro fertilization. He did write a book, what's it called, Revisiting Just War. That's one that I didn't mention that came out not that long ago. But I think he's less interested in telling, we never should have invaded Iraq, or we shouldn't invade this, or we shouldn't do that. I think he's more reluctant to do that, but he's very, very eager that the theological principles on which by which decisions should be informed, be made really publicly. So, thank you.
Very much.